You are the type of owner who knows your dog is more than a pet. You understand the bond. So imagine this: a dog who served overseas, ran missions in the dark, saved lives, came home, and then waited and waited. While the paperwork piled up, the kennel stayed quiet, and the world that once needed him moved on. This is the story of what happens when a hero has nowhere to go, and the one person who refused to look away. Every year, dogs are deployed alongside soldiers into some of the most dangerous places on Earth. They detect explosives. They track threats. They walk point into situations no human wants to enter first. And when the mission ends, when the deployment is over and the unit flies home, most of those dogs come back too. But coming back is not the same as coming home. For many retired military dogs, the journey doesn't end with a reunion. It ends in a kennel, waiting for a system that was never designed to move fast enough. His name, for the purposes of this story, was Ranger. Not his official designation that was a string of letters and numbers on a tag clipped to his collar, but the handlers who worked with him called him Ranger. And the name fit. Ranger was a large dog, the kind built for endurance rather than speed. Dense through the chest, quiet on his feet, alert in a way that made people around him instinctively straighten up. He had been trained for detection work, explosives primarily, and he was exceptional at it. Over the course of multiple deployments, he and his handlers had cleared routes, swept compounds, and flagged devices that would have killed people who never knew how close they came. He was, by every measure, a working dog at the peak of what working dogs do. Then his body started catching up with him. The joints went first. Nothing catastrophic, nothing that happened overnight. Just a gradual stiffness after long patrols, a reluctance to climb that hadn't been there before. The veterinary assessments confirmed what the handlers already suspected. Ranger was aging out. The physical demands of active deployment were no longer something he could sustain without risking real injury. He was retired from service. And that is where the story gets complicated. Because retiring a military dog sounds like the beginning of something good. Rest, safety, a home. But the bureaucratic reality of what happens to a retired working dog is not a clean, simple transition. There are evaluations. There are waiting periods. There is paperwork that moves through channels at a pace that has nothing to do with urgency. Ranger was placed in a kennel facility while his case was processed. Not a shelter exactly, a professional holding environment. Clean, managed, but a kennel nonetheless. A far cry from the structured purpose that had defined every day of his working life. For a dog trained to be in constant motion, constant engagement, the silence of that kennel was its own kind of difficulty. The first option the military pursues for retired working dogs is adoption by the handler who worked most closely with them. It makes sense. The bond is already there. The dog knows the person. The transition is easier, but it doesn't always work out. Ranger's primary handler, a young specialist who had deployed with him twice, had received new orders. A reassignment that made taking a dog with joint problems and specific care requirements genuinely impossible, at least for now. He didn't abandon Ranger. He filed a request to adopt. He wrote letters. He made calls. The system said not yet, maybe later. Fill out this form. So Ranger waited. The second option is adoption by another veteran or by law enforcement. Military working dogs with Ranger's background are considered high-value placements. Their training doesn't disappear when the service ends. A dog who has been conditioned to work, to focus, to respond under pressure, that is not a dog you place carelessly. Several inquiries came in, some from law enforcement agencies, interested in his detection background, some from veterans who had heard about his case through informal networks. the kind of word of mouth that moves through military communities faster than any official announcement. But each inquiry hit a snag. One agency determined his age made the retraining investment impractical. One veteran had the space and the experience, but lived in a state where the logistics of transfer created delays that stretched weeks into months. Another interested party passed initial screening but failed the home visit details unspecified in the records, but the result was the same. Ranger's kennel stay extended. And here is where the story shifts. About 60 miles from the facility where Ranger was being held, a woman named Carol was going through her own kind of transition. Carol was in her mid-40s. She had spent 2 decades working in logistics support for a military contractor, not a soldier, never deployed, but someone who had spent her career adjacent to military operations. She knew the culture. She understood in a practical rather than abstract way what it meant to be useful and then suddenly not. Her husband had passed the previous year. Long illness, expected but still devastating when it finally happened. They had always talked about getting a dog, a real dog, a big dog, not a puppy but something with some substance to it. Her husband had grown up with working dogs on his family's property, and he had a particular respect for animals that had a job to do. They never got around to it while he was alive. After he passed, Carol didn't pursue it. The house was too quiet already. Adding a dog felt like it might make the absence louder, not softer, so she waited. She wasn't sure what she was waiting for. Then a colleague forwarded her a post. It was from an advocacy group that worked to place retired military working dogs, one of several organizations that exists specifically because the official adoption pipeline sometimes moves too slowly, and dogs age out of optimal placement. Windows while the paperwork catches up. The post had a photo. A large dog sitting in a kennel, looking directly at the camera with an expression that was not sad, exactly more like patient. Like a dog who had learned that waiting was part of the job and was doing it with the same discipline he brought to everything else. The caption read Ranger, retired military working dog, needs experienced home, preference for someone who understands working dog behavior. Carol stared at that photo for a long time. She called the organization the next morning. The screening process was not casual. The advocacy group took placement seriously, particularly for dogs with Ranger's background. Carol filled out an extensive application. She submitted to a phone interview, then an in-person interview at her home. The interviewer, a veteran herself, someone who had handled working dogs professionally, walked through Carol's house, assessed the yard, asked detailed questions about her daily schedule, her experience with dogs, her understanding of what a retired working dog actually needed. It wasn't just about love. Love wasn't enough, the interviewer explained plainly. A working dog who had spent years in structured, purposeful environments didn't retire the way a pet retired. The drive didn't disappear. The need for engagement, for a task, for a relationship built on clarity and consistency, that was still there. If you brought a dog like Ranger into a home and just let him exist without structure, you weren't doing him a kindness. You were setting him up for anxiety. Carol listened carefully. She asked good questions. She did not oversell herself. At the end of the visit, the interviewer sat quietly for a moment. Then she said, "I think you might actually understand what you are getting into." The approval came through 10 days later. The transport was arranged. Ranger would be driven from the facility to a midpoint location where Carol would meet him for the first formal introduction, a neutral space. No home territory yet. Just 2 individuals getting acquainted on equal ground. Carol arrived early. She stood in a parking lot beside a park, holding a leash she hadn't used yet, trying not to appear as nervous as she felt. The transport van pulled in. The handler who stepped out with Ranger was calm, professional, giving the dog time to orient before making any introductions. Ranger stepped out of the van and stood still, reading the environment, the smells, the sounds, the unfamiliar woman standing 20 feet away. The handler gave Carol a quiet nod. She walked toward them slowly. No rushing, no high energy. She stopped a few feet away and crouched down slightly, not forcing contact, just making herself smaller and less imposing. Ranger looked at her. She looked at him. He took 2 steps forward and pressed his nose briefly against her hand. The handler exhaled. "That's a good sign," she said. "He doesn't do that with everyone." The first 2 weeks were harder than Carol expected, not because Ranger was aggressive or destructive. He was neither. But the adjustment was real, and it showed in small ways. He paced at night. He stationed himself near the front door for hours, as if waiting for a call that wasn't coming. He was polite but watchful, the kind of watchful that comes from years of being responsible for noticing things. Carol had been coached on what to expect. She established a routine immediately. Morning walks at the same time, same route. Structured feeding. Training sessions short, consistent, low stakes, just to give Ranger something to do with his focus. She was not trying to run him through military exercises. She was just giving him a context. A structure that said, "This is our day, this is what we do, you are still a dog with a purpose." Somewhere in the 3rd week, something shifted. It wasn't dramatic. There was no single moment Carol could point to. But one evening she was sitting in the backyard as the sun went down, and Ranger came and lay down next to her chair, not at attention, not watching the perimeter. Just lying down, relaxed, present. She put her hand on his side and felt him breathe. She said, out loud, to nobody in particular, "There you are." The joint issues that had ended Ranger's service required ongoing management. Carol worked with a veterinarian who had experience with working dogs to establish a care plan, anti-inflammatory medication, hydrotherapy sessions twice a week, modified exercise that kept him moving without overloading the joints that gave him trouble. It was not cheap. Carol had anticipated that. She had looked at the numbers before she applied and made a decision that the cost was one she was willing to carry. Her colleague who had sent her the original post had offered to help organize a small fundraiser among people in their network who knew about Ranger's situation, and Carol had accepted without embarrassment. This was not the time for pride. The hydrotherapy sessions became something Carol looked forward to almost as much as Ranger seemed to. Watching a dog who had spent years on hard ground move through water with something close to ease, it was unexpectedly moving. The therapist who ran the facility told Carol that working dogs often responded particularly well to hydrotherapy because the buoyancy removed the pressure, but the resistance still gave them something to push against. They were still working, just differently. Months passed. Ranger's original handler, the specialist who had filed to adopt and been told not yet, eventually reached out through the advocacy organization. His situation had changed. The reassignment had ended. He was stateside, more settled, and he wanted to know how Ranger was doing. Carol invited him to visit. The reunion was quiet. The handler arrived on a Saturday morning, and when Ranger saw him, there was no frantic display, no leaping, no barking. Just a long, intent look. Then Ranger walked to him and leaned against his leg. The handler crouched and put both arms around the dog and didn't say anything for a while. Carol stood back and watched, and understood something she hadn't fully articulated before. She wasn't replacing what Ranger had lost. She was adding to what he still had. The handler was part of Ranger's story. She was part of it now, too. These things didn't cancel each other out. The handler visited twice more over the following months. Each time felt less like a handoff and more like a family arrangement that nobody had planned but everyone had quietly accepted. At some point, Carol couldn't say exactly when Ranger stopped stationing at the front door. He started sleeping in the living room instead of near the exit. He began greeting Carol in the morning with something the vet described clinically as affiliative behavior, and Carol described simply as enthusiasm. He had figured out where he was. He had decided it was safe. There is a tendency, when telling stories like this one, to arrive at a moment of complete resolution, a day when everything aligns, a photograph that captures the exact instant the dog understood he was home. But real life doesn't always offer that. What Carol would tell you if you asked is that the story didn't have a single turning point. It had accumulated moments. The first time Ranger brought her a toy, something he had apparently decided she needed to engage with. The first walk where he moved beside her without scanning every shadow. The first night she didn't hear him pacing. And one afternoon, about 7 months in, when she was having a hard day, the kind of hard day that had no specific cause, just wait, and Ranger came and put his head in her lap and stayed there. She had gotten him because he needed a home. She hadn't fully considered that she might need him just as much. The broader reality behind Ranger's story is not a comfortable one. Thousands of dogs have served in military and law enforcement roles, and the systems designed to transition them into civilian life have improved significantly over the past 2 decades. But improvement is not the same as solved. Advocacy organizations continue to flag cases where dogs wait too long, where the pipeline stalls, where the placement window closes before a suitable home is found. The people who work in this space, handlers, veterinarians, adoption coordinators, volunteers, operate with a specific urgency because they understand what a working dog's kennel wait actually costs. Not in money, in the erosion of the very qualities that made the dog extraordinary in the first place. The focus, the adaptability, the willingness to engage, those things need somewhere to go. Carol understood this without being told. It was why the screening process had responded to her the way it did. She wasn't offering sympathy. She was offering structure, consistency, and enough respect for who Ranger was to not try to turn him into something easier to manage. That distinction mattered. It matters in every case like this one. Ranger's story is representative, not unique. There are dogs with similar histories in facilities right now, waiting for someone who understands the difference between adopting a dog and meeting a dog where he is. The gap between those two things is where most adoptions succeed or fail. The dogs do not need to be rescued from who they are. They need someone willing to show up for it. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who understands the bond between a dog and the person who shows up for them. And if you want to see more stories about dogs who served, survived, and found their way forward, stay here. There are more of them, every one of them worth knowing. If this story touched your heart, subscribe and stay with us. Every week, we uncover real dog stories that prove loyalty, survival, and love are stronger than fear. And if you want to support your own dog's journey, check the recommended products linked below.